My name is Daunting and I'm a Principal Cloud Architect at AWS Professional Services. At Professional Services, we are lucky enough to work very closely with customers, helping them along their cloud journey on a variety of interesting topics. Today, we're going to be talking about migrating existing accounts to a well-architected landing zone. In particular, we'll be talking about the Control Tower landing zone as a destination for your accounts. But this is not a Control Tower 101 session though. Instead, we're going to go a lot deeper, and I'll take you through a recent engagement where we helped a customer perform such a migration. So what are you going to learn? Through my narrative about engaging with this customer, who I'll now refer to as Acme, I'll detail what made them want to make a change and which areas you should assess on your own platform. As the target design is a Control Tower landing zone, I'll give a recap on what that actually is and the topics you should consider at design time. Ultimately, I want you to walk away from this session with the tools and tips that we used at Acme to give you confidence that you can plan and execute a migration of your own. So why consider a change? Why go to the effort of restructuring all your accounts? Because, after all, it does take some effort, as we shall see. So let's look at what triggered the project at Acme. This was their situation. They had 3 pair accounts and 3 separate invoices. I'll show AWS Organizations in the diagrams here, but they were actually only using the consolidated billing feature and not for any of the other goodness it can provide. The first set of accounts they called classic accounts, as these accounts had been around for 10 years or more and had organically grown in numbers along with the business. However, the other 2 pairs and associated accounts they had inherited, as Acme had also grown through mergers and acquisitions. As part of this process, they had also inherited tooling. So overall, they ended up with many accounts, a few hundred in total, being managed in slightly different ways. They did have a competent cloud platform team, so on the face of it, everything was okay, even if there was a lot of DevOps scripting happening to cater for the differences amongst the accounts. So their reason for change. Acme was about to venture into a new product domain, and as this would mean more accounts being added to their footprint, they asked AWS Professional Services to perform what we call an Executive Cloud Security Assessment, or ECSA for short. This is an engagement where we take a deep look at the platform and how it is run, asking the questions in 6 areas that you can see on the screen here. Based on the conversations that we had, we were able to identify a range of risks ranging from low to critical in severity. I'll list here the selection of findings that we felt could have been fixed by having a better landing zone in place. A lot of the risks were quite common in nature in the fact that there was no uniform application of rules or a single place where they could view conformance against compliance, monitor threat detection, or other things that needed to be mandated across groups and accounts and workloads. All up, there were 15 findings that we found could be remediated by a Control Tower landing zone. So let's take a deeper look into the Control Tower landing zone. But in general, what is a landing zone? Let's have a recap on that. The landing zone is named as such because it is a zone to land your AWS workloads. And if you use the landing zone, you can be sure that the accounts and their workloads will meet your company's security and governance requirements. This can be done by applying controls and guardrails that can be configured and managed centrally. As I inferred earlier, this was what was lacking at Acme and was picked up in the security assessment. That lack of central management and a centralized at-a-glance view into the AWS footprint. According to multi-account best practice, accounts should be used to separate workloads, and a landing zone should be designed with this in mind, and grouping by organizational units can help with this. We decided at Acme that a new landing zone was desirable, and one that had been designed as opposed to their existing setup, which could be best described as having evolved over time and now not meeting the requirements of the expanding company. So what to do next? Landing zones can be built by hand using white papers and a well-architected framework as a guide, but it can take effort and time. And this is where the Control Tower service comes in. The service was launched in 2019 with the aim to automate nearly all of the heavy lifting required to create a best practice landing zone. This base architecture you see here is what AWS Control Tower provides to customers within a few clicks in the console. Once enabled, AWS Control Tower provides a framework to set up a well-architected multi-account AWS environment based on security and compliance best practices. It is launched in the top-level account, or the management account as it's known, and tightly integrates with AWS Organizations. By using organizational units, accounts can be separated and governed by different sets of security policies as those groupings dictate. This was perfect for Acme, as it would quickly get them up and running with a base platform. For instance, out of the box they got SSO integration and the ability to provision a new account on demand that would automatically have the baseline controls applied to. You can see here the Control Tower dashboard, which enabled them to easily view the compliance status of their accounts within the landing zone according to the controls and guardrails the Control Tower provides out of the box. And this was a good start, but to remediate more of their security findings, additional AWS services were required. The caveat being that we still wanted a single pane of glass management. Central visibility and management is made easier now that more and more AWS services are natively integrating with AWS Organizations. As long as all your accounts are within a single AWS organization, you can enable services for all the accounts within it with just a few clicks or a line of code. Examples being Amazon Guard Duty, which can monitor network level activity for anomalies, and AWS Firewall Manager, so that you can be alerted to things like open security groups. Integrating across these security services can be done via AWS Security Hub. This service really does give that single pane of glass approach by aggregating the findings from all the various security services, prioritizing them, and putting them in one comprehensive view. This was really interesting to Acme, as they currently did not have that one single feed of security info. Through the mergers and acquisitions, they had inherited different toolsets, and although there had been attempts to standardize, there were differences in the formats and the commercial software being used. Security Hub would enable them to pipe all the alerts into the cyber team's chosen tooling. But in addition to findings aggregation, Security Hub has another nice feature which would really help Acme close a few more of the security recommendations. The ability to turn on checks for applicable benchmarks that they really should have been following for the types of work they were undertaking. Within a click or two, they could turn on the CIS benchmark or PCIS DSS for their payments-related accounts. And not only would it give them a score, but by highlighting the exact resources that needed attention, it would give them a good starting point for targeted remediation and to improve that compliance score. At this point, most Acme stakeholders were convinced that the single AWS Organizations and the Control Tower landing zone was the way to go. However, in the platform team, there was definitely a sense of, that sounds easy for a fresh install, but we have this complex setup of 3 different groups of accounts. And I also heard, it's not greenfields accounts we're worried about here. We have hundreds of accounts that we would need to migrate. And this might be exactly how you have been thinking when you've heard about the Control Tower service and read the various blogs and best practices. So let's talk about how we overcame this at Acme. Planning and executing a migration. As the title suggests, this is definitely not about greenfields accounts. This is about reorganizing existing accounts. For the rest of the presentation, I'll outline what we did and highlight the tips and tricks that helped Acme through a successful migration. Hopefully at the end of this, you'll be able to walk away with a plan for how you can do this in your own organization. So here are the 4 phases we went through at Acme and what you can use yourself as a base for your own migration project. First, we started with the landing zone design and build phase, the output of which meant we had somewhere to migrate the accounts to. But before we could do that, we had to understand if moving them was going to cause issues for the workloads running inside them. We wanted to minimize the disruption as much as possible. So this risk identification and migration planning stage was critically important. After this planning phase, we were ready to move a couple of accounts across in what we call the test migration phase, a phase where we could create and refine a list of migration steps. Once we had a solid plan in place, we could then progress to move the remainder of the accounts. And I'm going to dive into each of these phases one by one. Let's start at the beginning. Let's dive deeper into the first phase, which is the landing zone design and build phase. This phase is very important because to create the ideal landing zone, we needed to consider the various topics that I'm showing here. We did this at Acme by running a series of workshops with the right stakeholders in the room. For instance, the networking team and the cybersecurity team. These people need to be involved from the beginning on a journey such as this, as there are many decisions that cannot be made by a cloud platform team on their own. The approach was to take a decision log and create a high-level design based on the unique requirements of Acme. There are many AWS services and configuration options to choose from, and not all were suitable for Acme, just as they won't be for your organization. These workshops turned out very useful, a time to outline the best practices to the stakeholders and together to choose the right path going forward. The workshop started with account structure, where we designed the initial set of organizational units that we were going to use to group the workloads around. We'll dive deeper into this topic very soon. Next, we had security and governance, where we detailed the available guardrails and controls and captured which ones would be enabled in the new landing zone. There was a networking session, as this was an area that could be simplified for Acme. Their networking architecture had evolved through the years, and this has been showed by the different types of services that were being implemented. For instance, there was a lot of VPN connections, direct connect VIFs, and a mesh of VPC peering. Whilst their platform team was able to manage this, it was getting a bit hard to scale. Migrating to a new landing zone gave them the opportunity to simplify their networking by utilizing transit gateway and a hub and spoke account model. Acme decided they would approach this networking transition in a second phase once they brought accounts into Control Tower, as there were potential complexities to ensuring that there would be no disruption to their running workloads. Network migration is worthy of a talk on its own, so today we won't be covering this. On to operations. This is where we talked about things such as patching, tagging, and backup strategies and how they could be enforced in the new landing zone. Again, these were things that were desirable at Acme, but yet across the three collections of accounts were not being uniformly implemented. Finally, we covered identity and user access. Acme had a fairly permissive set of roles given to developers across all the accounts, and this was highlighted as a risk in the security assessment. There was definitely no standardization across the board. But using Control Tower and its integration with SSO, this issue could be relatively easily fixed up. In this workshop, we discussed standardizing on a set of roles and how this would work with their identity provider. So we can't cover all the topics today, but we will dive into a couple of them and also talk about how we actually built out the landing zone after the high-level design was completed. So coming back to account structure, this was something that Acme really didn't have in place already. Their accounts lived straight under the root OU of the three organizations. They were not segregating workloads based on security and policy requirements. Again, something that was highlighted in the security assessment and is against multi-account best practice. Actually, the multi-accounts best practice white paper is a really good read, and I recommend it to you to understand the reasoning behind a good OU structure. I'll share a link to this at the end of the presentation. After we completed the workshop, we ended up with a design like this. Each OU has a slightly different SCP allocated to them via this set of Control Tower guardrails enabled. I won't go through all the different OUs that were created, but I will mention a couple which turned out to be very useful. Firstly, the policy staging OU. This is where Acme could try out new policies on test accounts, so they could be sure of the effect before they applied it to the destination OU. This was useful because the last thing they wanted to do was to roll out a policy which affected the workloads that were running within that OU. Actually, Acme went one stage further with their ability to test out changes, and I'll touch on this a bit later on. The other OU that I'd like to call out was the migration OU. This was needed because the existing accounts had been created and used with no enforcing policies via SCP, nor was there any visibility into their compliance status. It was highly likely that when they moved into their new OU, lots of things could be reported non-compliant, or worse, things might stop working altogether. The migration OU was created with a slightly less restrictive set of guardrails enabled, and it was a place where they could see non-compliance alerts but still had the wiggle room in the SCPs to fix them. The intention of this OU was the accounts should only reside in this temporarily whilst violations are checked and remediated, at which point the account can be then moved into its destination OU. So moving on from the design phase into the build phase. One pressing question that we had to tackle very early on was, where does this landing zone live? There are two options available to anyone doing this type of migration. The first is to use an existing AWS Organizations and launch Control Tower within it. This is actually the best option to take if you have just a single organization, because the accounts you would move into the landing zone do not need to come from an external organization. However, because Control Tower is launched from the management account, which is the top level parent account, and because a lot of the critical features of your landing zone would be administered from this account, you want to ensure that the least amount of people as possible have access to this account. As such, it is highly recommended by AWS that no workloads are running in the management account. This was not the case at Acme. In each of their three pair accounts, they had workloads running within them. Therefore, none of their existing AWS organizations were suitable for them to use for Control Tower. This left us with the second option. Create a brand new AWS organizations and launch Control Tower within that. This is a slightly more complicated scenario, as there are considerations to be explored when moving accounts from one organization to another. And it is these considerations we will explore further in the rest of this talk. Before I get to those, let's talk about how Acme went on to build the landing zone once we had the design locked in. The Control Tower service is enabled with a few clicks in the management account. From the console, you can assign guardrails and controls to specific OUs and enroll accounts within them. This is a relatively easy exercise. However, at Acme during the design phase, we decided to use some AWS services within the landing zone that were not controlled via the Control Tower console. So how did we enhance the landing zone with the bespoke controls and services that were required to meet the desired security and governance requirements? This is where an AWS solution called Customizations for Control Tower comes in, or CFCT for short. This is a solution that's launched in the management account that enables you to launch your own CloudFormation templates and SCPs to specific organizational units. For example, you can see the YAML configuration file here, called the manifest file. We have defined an extra SCP to block public access to S3 buckets, and this will be applied to all the accounts in the infrastructure, non-prod, prod, and sandbox OUs. Below this, we have a template that will enable the VPC flow logs to be sent to the central logging account. The solution hooks into lifecycle events for Control Tower, such as new account being created. These events trigger the pipeline to process the manifest file and deploy the designated solutions, so you can be sure that when an account is created, the baseline controls you have specified are almost immediately applied to that account, in addition to the Control Tower guardrails that you've enabled. At Acme, this was a really good way for the platform team to centrally manage the accounts in the company, and I recommend that you take a look at the CFCT solution yourselves to help you build out and manage your Control Tower landing zone. Now, I just mentioned we used the CFCT to turn on additional services in the landing zone. Most of these extra services were security related, as this helped to remediate the vast majority of the security findings. At Acme, we kickstarted the implementation of these services by using the examples in the AWS Security Reference Architecture, or SRA as it's known. This goldmine of information describes the best practices when it comes to using AWS security services. Importantly, the SRA has a codebase on GitHub with examples specifically tailored for deployment using the CFCT. This enabled us to very quickly set up things like Guard Duty, IAM Access Analyzer, Macie, and Security Hub, to name a few. And using the SRA, we were confident that it was set up in the correct best practice way. So with the landing zone built out and ready to accommodate new accounts, it meant that Acme could now start considering some migrations, which moves us into the next phase of the project. The risk identification and migration planning phase. Let's recall that Acme were not able to activate Control Tower in any of their existing AWS organizations, so they had to create a new one. This means that the accounts were being migrated from one organization to another. And this movement can cause issues. One of the most important goals of a project like this is to not disrupt workloads at all when moving accounts across. Hence, we have this second phase. Simply put, this is the time that you should spend assessing existing accounts for what might break. I'll talk about what we did at Acme, but please note this cannot be taken as a definitive list, as everybody's existing AWS footprint is different. And therefore, you might have extra things to consider for your migration. But the things that we're going to cover here should be common for migrations between organizations. The most important thing we needed to do was identify dependencies on AWS Organizations itself. Increasingly, services natively integrate with AWS Organizations, as we have seen with the security services. One such example is Resource Access Manager, where you can share resources between accounts. For example, you can share a subnet or transit gateway to all the accounts in an organization. Another example is using the CloudFormation StackSets feature of Deploy to OU. Also, organization IDs can be used with IAM resource policies. For example, S3 bucket policies that allowed read access to any account in an organization using a condition key. And these are really useful and powerful features, but what this means when you remove the account from the organization is that those things will most likely break, and this is likely to have catastrophic effects on your workloads. Anything discovered like this needs to be remediated, so there is little to no downtime when an account is moved across the orgs. This can cause extra effort, and meticulous planning is required depending on the type of dependency discovered. Acme were pretty sure that no one was using any of these features, but they admitted they could not be 100% sure. Therefore, all accounts still needed to be checked. Because there are so many services where a dependency could be hiding, identifying them was going to be a laborious task if done manually, not to mention error-prone, as it is easy to miss something if you're hunting through settings in a console. And at Acme, we were talking about a few hundred accounts. Luckily, we've written some automation scripts at AWS which we were able to use. It's called the Organizations Dependency Checker tool. It's a solution that is deployed to the management account, and by utilizing a role that's deployed to your existing accounts, it can iterate through each of them and look for the dependencies within them programmatically. It is not an exhaustive solution, however, but it is being updated all the time and does cater for a high percentage of the services you need to check. The nice thing about this solution is that it produces an Excel spreadsheet where you can easily identify which resources you need to go and take a look at. We used this to great effect at Acme, where we did actually find some troublesome resources and as a consequence had to come up with a remediation plan for each of them. Now, about alert floods. Because there had been no way to assess compliance against standards, such as now were being implemented via Security Hub, it turns out that some of the accounts we were migrating at Acme were actually quite non-compliant. Because of this, we caused an alert flood on one occasion because many of the compliance checks immediately triggered as soon as we brought that account into the new landing zone. This was not a pleasant experience for the cyber team, and consequently, it was not a very good experience for the platform team either. So we improved the process and decided that it would be a good idea to check compliance before the migration occurred. The way we implemented this was to use a supporting feature of AWS config called conformance packs. These are sets of config rules that can be applied to an account at any point in time. There are conformance packs for the control tower detective controls and also for other standards we're using, such as the SYS benchmark. By knowing what issues they were pre-migration, we found it a much better experience to proactively reduce the compliance down to an acceptable level before migration and therefore avert an alert flood. It soon turned out that this approach was beneficial in more than one way. Not only were we averting alert floods, we also found that making the results available to the account team owners for them to see and to remediate gave them ownership and buy-in to the migration project. Previously, it was the platform team doing the bulk of the migration work, and the account owners were not being notified or even aware that their account was being migrated until right at the last minute. So, conformance packs are a really powerful tool, and I would recommend looking into these for your own migration. A non-technical but nonetheless very important thing we had to do was to update some of the administration that was in place. In the case of Acme, they had reserved instances and saving plans, which were helping them to reduce their monthly bills. To continue with these discounts, they needed to be updated with a new organisation ID. A thing to note is the effect is quite different on these two features. Reserved instances can be moved easily and they'll keep their existing terms, but savings plans get cancelled. You'll get a credit for the unused time and then they'll start a new term, effectively resetting the clock. If you have anything like this in place, I suggest you talk to the account team or support like we did. They'll help you assist with the changes. Now back to the more technical stuff. I talked earlier about how Acme were using the policy staging OU to test out changes before they were deployed into production. This was and still is a good idea. However, Acme wanted a completely separate environment where they could train up their new team members on Control Tower and the CFCT solution. So what they did was to create a separate dev landing zone. Remember, you can only have one Control Tower service activated in an organization. So as they had none spare, they used a credit card to create a new account and launch Control Tower within that. The intention was that they were going to use this for the duration of the migration project only. However, the cost of running Control Tower is actually free, and it's only those underlying resources that you pay for. Acme decided it was worth the small cost to gain the extra agility and the ability to give new team members confidence before they started using the production landing zone. And their dev landing zone is still in use today. After inspecting the accounts for issues, we now had a few accounts that were non-critical and had little to no remediation work to be performed. We were ready to head into the test migration phase. This is a phase where all eyes are on account migration as it happens, and we build out and refine a migration runbook. A runbook is a set of repeatable instructions to perform a task. In our case, the runbook was to contain all the instructions required to move an account successfully to the new landing zone. An example of what we used at Acme is on the screen. It's not a complete set, but you could use this as a base for your own. A lot of the information for the steps was copy and pasted from the various AWS service documentation, making it handy to have in one single place. We included the one-off prerequisites and also the per-account migration steps. When we moved the first account across, we found things that we'd missed out, but that was okay. We added in the missing steps into the runbook, and this helped improve it for the next time. By the time we moved a third account across, we found that we didn't have anything else to add to the runbook. This was a really good indication that we were ready to move into the core migration phase. That doesn't mean to say that we captured everything. The runbook is a living document and we kept updating it all the time. This is a tip for you and your migration. Use a runbook and iterate on it and you'll be much more likely to repeat success. You can even use it to spot areas where you can automate some of the steps using AWS APIs, rather than making it all ClickOps in the console. On to the core migration phase. This was now a rinse and repeat phase of the project where we used the runbook and migrated all remaining accounts. But what order did we migrate them in? It wasn't random. What we did at Acme was to prioritize all the accounts, and we did this on a set of criteria similar to the ones on the screen. Effectively, we went from the least complex accounts to the most complex, buying some time for the latter. Target OU suitability, i.e., does this account live in non-prod or prod? We found a few that had both non-production and production workloads within them. This made it hard to decide where the account should live in the new landing zone, and we actually ended up splitting them into two new accounts. As such, these accounts ended up much lower down the priority list, so there was more time to make the changes. Conformance packs, the worst offending accounts, were pushed down the list. Organisational dependencies were approached on a case-by-case basis. Some were easy to fix and some less so. Lastly, networking. Acme had a two-phase approach to networking changes, but your approach might be different, so do consider if networking weighs in on the order. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it can start you on your way. And that's a wrap. With migration in full swing, it took a couple of months to migrate a few hundred accounts. The duration of such a project like this is of course going to be dependent on the state of your existing accounts. It's quite possible that you're not using any organisational features and your accounts are in a good state compliance-wise, in which case it could be a much shorter time to move to a new landing zone. But I don't want you to walk away thinking there is no effort at all. It should be a well planned out project, following the above phases at least, and take your time at the beginning of the project so you can reap the benefits later on. After the project concluded at Acme, we went from 3 disparate collections of accounts that as a platform caused 15 medium and high risks to be called out as part of their security assessment. After creating a new control to landing zone, it went to this. A single AWS Organizations for all their accounts, and using Control Tower and other AWS services, Acme were now confident that any account within this landing zone was compliant and in line with their organisational policies. We fixed all 15 of the security findings. Overall, a huge success, and consequently, because of the single pane of glass management approach, their cloud team now has a much easier job of managing the platform. So what do I want you to take away from this session? Hopefully, from following the journey we had at Acme, you can see what benefits an enhanced Control Tower landing zone can bring. We talked about the drivers as to why you might want to make the switch. In the case of Acme, it was discovering that their security posture was suboptimal. In your case, you might not need anything as formal as a security assessment, but do take some time to assess your single pane of glass view and central management capability of your platform. If you find that you do not have one, or only for certain aspects and not others, it could be worth considering a migration to a Control Tower landing zone. I talked through each of the 4 phases we followed, but I'd like to stress the importance of the landing zone design phase. This is your chance to do things according to best practice, and there are lots of areas to consider, so don't skip on this one, and it will help you down the line for sure. Lastly, I highlighted a few of the tools and processes that we used at Acme, and I recommend to look into these, and these will greatly help speed up your migration. Now, you might have noticed the Top Tips logo on some of the slides. If you didn't, hit rewind and go and have a look. These are the things that I think will really help you. For convenience, I've put QR codes here that would take you straight to the official documentation of 3 of them. I'm pretty sure you'll find them useful. I will also be publishing a blog on this migration topic very soon, so keep an eye out for that one. And in addition to those specific landing zone links, there is also a vast trove of training resources for you to officially skill up on your cloud journey, and you can bookmark these at your leisure. And that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful, and I wish you well on your cloud migration journey should you choose to accept it. One last thing, I'd really appreciate it if you could fill out the session survey, as the feedback is always welcome to improve our talks. Thank you.